Today we're joined by Izzy Crawford from the School of Creative and Cultural Business, and she's going to be tackling quite a topical subject today. This past year has been extremely challenging for all businesses, as we've all had to adapt to deal with the restrictions imposed with us as a result of the pandemic. And the last thing that any organisation needs at this time is reputational damage, which is why crisis communication management is so important. So Izzy's going to provide some practical advice this afternoon on how you can take some effective steps to protect your organisation from reputational harm at this time, and also, in any situations going forward. So thank you, Izzy.
Thank you, Sarah. Well, hello and welcome to the webinar. As Sarah said, my name is Izzy Crawford, and I'm an academic strategic lead in the School of Creative and Cultural Business at RGU. Prior to becoming a lecturer in public relations 15 years ago, I worked as a communication manager for the NHS, dealing with a range of public health issues, such as localised E. coli outbreaks. However, the current global pandemic takes everything we know about crisis communications to another level, and we are all very much on one enormous learning curve. So this webinar will seek to provide you with some practical advice for how organisations can take effective steps to try and protect themselves from reputational harm during the pandemic, using established crisis communication principles and techniques. The key takeaways that we hope you will get from this webinar are, firstly, what are the possible causes of reputational harm during a pandemic? Secondly, how does a crisis impact reputation? And finally, some of the things that you can do to improve your own crisis communications. Now, I'm conscious that we have a very diverse audience today with a range of backgrounds and levels of experience. So I do apologise if some of these principles feel like well-trodden ground for some of you, but I think it's important just to perhaps do a refresher around what are the key things that we should be perhaps considering at a time like this, very much from the communications perspective. This webinar includes crisis communication principles and techniques, which are covered in more depth in the university's short course on crisis communications, which is affiliated with the Chartered Institute of Public Relations. More information about this can be found on the RGU website, or you can contact me directly afterwards to find out more. The course has been developed in conjunction with leading crisis and reputation management consultant Ella Minty, who is credited with much of the insight and advice that you will hear today. In the next 40 minutes, I'm going to try and unpack some of the concepts on this slide and offer some advice for protecting your organisation's reputation during the pandemic. The key concepts we will cover include understanding complex business environments and how to communicate effectively with a diverse range of publics and stakeholders during a crisis. First of all, I'd like to just set the scene a little bit, and I know that all of us are painfully aware of the world that we're living in just now, but I thought it might be useful just to look at some facts and figures relating to the situation. So according to Andrew Walker, who's the BBC World Service economics correspondent, on the 10th of June 2020, he said that the OECD, which is the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, found that the UK's largely service-based economy meant that it had been particularly badly hit by the government's lockdown restrictions. The services sector, including financial services, hospitality and tourism, makes up about 3/4 of the UK's GDP. In June, the OECD suggested that the lockdown measures brought in by most governments have succeeded in slowing the spread of the virus and in reducing the death toll, but they have also frozen business activity in many sectors, widened inequality, disrupted education, and undermined confidence in the future. As restrictions begin to be eased, the path to economic recovery remains highly uncertain and vulnerable to a second wave of infections. With or without a second outbreak, the consequences will be severe and long-lasting. So that was back in June. We are now, of course, in the second outbreak, which aligns with the red line that you can see on this graph. Without a second outbreak, we were projected to follow the purple line. The green line was the projection without the pandemic. So there isn't really any doubt that we are experiencing one of the worst global crises the world has ever seen. Most organisations engage in varying degrees of risk management as part of their everyday business. The pandemic presents an exceptionally high degree of uncertainty for organisations of all shapes and sizes, which has precipitated an unprecedented response in terms of risk management. While risk management involves attributing a numerical figure based on probability and severity of risk and corresponding mitigating action, crisis management analyses various categories and families of crises and the potential for a chain reaction. So now that we have established that we are indeed in the midst of a significant global crisis, let's have a look at the kind of things that can cause reputational harm. Natural disasters are usually quite rare and relatively short-lived. The pandemic is rather like a supervolcano, where the effects of multiple smaller outbreaks or smaller volcanoes add up to a much bigger negative impact. This slide shows the kind of sources that corporate crises typically arise from, all of which remain a possibility alongside the pandemic. Government policy has become a new significant source, and health and safety concerns have also leapt off the standard textbook page of where crises can originate from. A good place to start with crisis communications is a situational analysis, typically involving tools like a PESTLE or SWOT analysis, looking at the political, economic, social, technological, legal, and environmental issues affecting the organisation, and also looking at the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats for the organisation as well. This can help to identify key external and internal issues which could contribute to a crisis developing. On this slide, I have listed some of the pandemic-related external issues which could apply to many organisations right now. Within your own organisation, you could then refine this further to focus on issues which are specific to your line of work. Again, here, I have suggested some of the issues internally related to the pandemic, which could generate bigger problems for an organisation and may benefit from closer scrutiny and planning. In normal times, most of these things would not present significant concern or require an extraordinary response. However, the pandemic has brought all of them into the foreground so intensely and so rapidly that it can be very difficult for organisations to react effectively with the resources that they have. When you are conducting research into the environmental context, there are things to watch out for which could make the situation worse. So if we are not keeping our finger on the pulse of what's happening externally and internally, we run the risk of missing a very important issue, which could then develop into something more serious, into a crisis. Without effective planning and action, we're unlikely to be able to address those problems. A slow or inappropriate response to what's happening around us can also be damaging. But equally, if we don't have clear, decisive leadership, if we don't think about how we can perhaps operate differently within this context, we also run the risk of further reputational harm. So this brings us to the second takeaway for the webinar, which is how does a crisis impact reputation? Reputation is the result of what you say, but more importantly, what you do and what other people say about you. So we're going to look now at some of the determinants of corporate reputation. The first is financial performance, as we might expect. The next one, emotional appeal, involving trust and admiration from your key stakeholders and audiences, is particularly important when it comes to reputation, and perhaps even more so during a crisis, as people are looking to see the level of emotional intelligence on display within organizations and how they are reacting to what's happening to the community and what's happening to society. Of course, the quality of your products and services are always going to be critical to reputation, but innovation now more than ever for many organizations has been absolutely vital to their survival. The workplace environment being well managed, having happy employees, again, always an important thing in terms of reputation. But if your employees are not happy, and in the current context of the pandemic, there's a good chance that that might be happening, it can be very damaging to reputation because, of course, employees are your main ambassadors for your brand and for what you do. Socially and environmentally responsible organisations can benefit reputationally from the kind of initiatives that they put into place. But of course, during the pandemic, some of those CSR initiatives might suffer. There might just not be the available funds or resources to keep them going. So that could also have a detrimental impact on reputation. And finally, the vision and the leadership within the organisation can also have a positive or negative effect on the reputation of the organisation. There are key players which are involved in the reputation of any organisation. And if you look at the textbooks on crisis communication, typically they will highlight clients or customers, employees, the wider public and investors as having a significant influence over whether or not you have a positive or negative reputation. So it's important to ensure that all your key stakeholders are communicated with effectively during the crisis, that their own particular set of needs are understood and as far as possible met in communication terms. This slide shows the reputational impact of a crisis on each key stakeholder group. So the first one is customers. Customers' perception of the organisation can result obviously in a reduction in future revenue and operating cash flow if they are not happy or if they perceive things negatively. Employees, managers might leave if they feel dissatisfied with the way the organisation is handling the crisis, might move to a competitor or have reduced work motivation. And in a situation like this one, where everybody is affected by the pandemic, there isn't anybody who is not affected in some way, we can automatically assume that this is going to impact on employees and their perception of how their workplace is reacting. Suppliers and business partners might adjust their terms and conditions, change their contracts and negotiation costs, particularly if they are struggling in light of what's happening as well. Investors might review their estimates and may decide not to invest if they feel that the organisation is not handling the situation well. If you'd like to know more about this, I've noted some of the sources at the bottom here that you can read up more about it if you want to. Okay, so what I'd like to do now is just give you very briefly a few examples of some PR disasters that have happened during the pandemic to help illustrate some of the challenges and pitfalls of crisis communication. So some of these case studies are attributed to Abby Gray, who is a senior account executive at Prohibition PR, and I've included the link here to her blog. And she regularly updates this with some really interesting examples if you want to find out more and perhaps learn from other people's mistakes. Okay, so the first one, central government. In a time, according to Abby, that's riddled with uncertainty, clarity and consistency in what's needed, which unfortunately many feel as though the UK government have failed to provide with their most recent campaign, the slogan that was used, "Stay home," was then changed to "Stay alert" down in England. And that left many people wondering, well, what exactly does that mean? So the need for concrete terms, unambiguous terms in your communication is absolutely vital during a crisis. If people don't understand what the instruction is, it's unlikely that they'll follow it. And of course, we could probably talk for hours just about government communications at all levels and the different approaches and mistakes that have been made, but we don't have time to do that, unfortunately. Maybe that's another webinar for another day. The next one we come to is education. Poor planning and stakeholder consultation arguably led to the need for a U-turn by the SQA in the summer, and many of the same students who were affected then moved into their campus accommodation in the autumn, only to be locked down, sparking fury as students felt misled and shortchanged. So this is a very high profile example, and it affected the whole of the UK education sector. And while it's, I guess, easy in hindsight to see where some of the errors might have been made, of course, all of the people that are making these decisions are operating in an exceptionally compressed time frame to make exceedingly difficult decisions with very limited resources. And under those conditions, it's perhaps not surprising that communication mistakes are more likely to be made. So in the absence of more time, and perhaps enlisting more resources to help you to reduce the risk of human error might be worth considering, although again, not necessarily that easy to achieve. The next one is a hospitality related scenario. Tim Martin, who's the boss of Wetherspoons, initially told his 43,000 staff that they would not be paid at all until the government furlough scheme began, which could leave them out of pocket for almost 2 months. This statement was later reversed following the unsurprising backlash that it received. The next communication that employees received was from their boss encouraging them to take jobs at Tesco if they wished to do so. This was deemed highly insensitive and pretty unhelpful. And so perhaps what this particular case illustrates is the importance of internal communication being as important as external communication, and the need for sensitivity in those communications. Fashion retail, the O'Polly example, to show appreciation for NHS frontline workers during the coronavirus pandemic, fashion brand O'Polly launched a competition on social media for workers to be in with a chance of winning a care package, a new outfit, and an invitation to a virtual party. A nurse from Glasgow apparently won the competition, but couldn't make the virtual event due to working a 12-hour shift. She was then told by the brand that despite winning the competition, she couldn't receive the care package or the outfit due to not being able to attend the virtual party. According to Abby, who writes the blog, taking to Twitter, the nurse wrote, "Imagine entering an O'Polly competition for NHS workers and winning, but can't participate due to working a 12-hour shift on Friday on the front line, and then being told you can't claim the prize because you can't be on the video call." So unsurprisingly, this blew up on social media, gaining over 14,000 likes and multiple responses, highlighting disappointment in the brand, saying how it defeats the point of holding a competition for NHS workers. And it was also picked up by the media. So unfortunately here, the best of intentions to try and do something good during the pandemic went wrong. And just by making sure that the details are carefully thought through, very important. So it's just a sort of note of caution if anyone's thinking about doing something similar. And the final example we have is Aer Lingus. Aer Lingus tried to adapt to the new social distancing guidelines that have come into play on their flights, promising customers that more flights would take place to avoid overcrowding. Of course, that wasn't quite as simple as it seemed, and the passengers were less than impressed when these measures were not put into place on board their flight. This caused a real backlash from customers and naturally made their way onto social media. And as Abby says in her blog, this was followed with a rather disappointing remark from the airline's chief executive, who admitted that social distancing on flights just isn't realistic. Which brings the question, if you can't provide something, why offer it? So if you are saying that you'll do something, make sure that you can deliver it, or it could really have the opposite effect of what you are looking for. So very quickly, some facts about reputation. It can't be bought, it can't be disregarded, it can't be replaced, it can't have a price, but it can be sold. If you're selling your business on and it has a positive reputation, whoever buys it will inherit that. It can be built through time and thought and applying appropriate principles of communication. And it can be saved if it's gone wrong. There are steps that you can take to do damage limitation as well. And it can be invaluable to an organisation too. So again, here's some sources if anybody wants to read up some more about this. So it brings us on to the big question then of what matters most in a crisis. There isn't an easy answer to this, of course. If you're talking about it from a theoretical point of view, you might choose various versions of the public response and reaction, the business recovery strategy that's being used, which would be correct, but perhaps only from a very strict financial or business perspective in terms of sustainability. Throughout the pandemic, the lives and livelihoods affected have been or perhaps should be the most important consideration in terms of crisis communication, because this is what matters most to people. But it is a very delicate and very difficult balance to achieve. And every day when we listen to the government briefings, we can hear the tension and the struggle in terms of communicating around this, because all of these things matter and matter to people, and we're all affected by it. But this, in terms of crisis communication, is what people are most concerned about. So in a crisis that involves loss of life and livelihood, nothing is ever more important than the community that has been impacted by that crisis, which goes beyond the everyday duty of care that your client or employer might have, and beyond any legal responsibilities that you might have as well. And it's really going into the spirit of it and what that means, and caring about the impact on people. So today, perhaps more than ever before, no organisation can claim sustainability, care, social purpose, or any of these frequently cited attributes in a corporate mission or value statement without really demonstrating care for the community that it impacts. So when it comes to people and how people perceive a crisis, we know that people can talk about how they feel about things very quickly, and we have instant global discussion, and this is now continuous.
Oh no, you're right.
So the power of rapid, multi-way, borderless, user-generated communication is not always understood by leaders or by anyone else. It's a very powerful thing. A lie can travel around the world and back again, while the truth is lacing up its boots, allegedly, Mark Twain said, but we don't actually know if he actually really did say that. There's the jury's out on that one too. So we're in a world dominated by fake news, conspiracy theories. We've got a picture of the 5G kills brain cells and bees one there as just one of many, many examples. And most of this circulates on social media. So one of the first key principles during the crisis is that social media platforms should not be neglected or misused during the crisis. So I'm about to show you now from Hootsuite some analytics that they've done to help illustrate where people are spending their time and what kind of communication devices that they're looking at. So this is taken from April 2020, and what you can see on the slide straight away, 76% is that most people are getting their information on their phone. So communications need to work on that type of device. What this slide tells us is that more people are watching streaming services than conventional media. So they are not necessarily watching the evening news on their TV as they might have done even just a few years ago. Online news sources are perhaps more likely to be viewed, and particularly on a mobile phone. TikTok was the most globally downloaded app in April 2020. WhatsApp was second, followed by Facebook, then Instagram. Zoom comes in at number 6, reflecting the move online. These appear to be the key communication platforms where people are receiving and generating information during the pandemic. Which brings us on to our final takeaway. How can you improve your crisis communications? So we've considered sources of crisis and the impact of reputational harm during a crisis. And we've also started to look at where people have been getting their information during the pandemic. We will now consider some of the fundamental principles of effective crisis communications and how they might be applied. Skip slide, there we go. So to be a good crisis communicator, as we've already mentioned, it's important to understand that humans are very complex. So a one-size-fits-all message probably isn't going to work because people have different values, different cultures, different religious beliefs, different personal interests, and absolutely different political persuasions as well. And so we need to think very carefully about who our audiences are and what kind of messaging is going to work best for them. And it may be that we need to take our core message and adapt it several times, depending on the audiences that we are communicating with. With all good communications, a strategic response is vital. And in any strategic communications scenario, you would start with research, you would plan your action, have your SMART objectives, you would identify who your audiences are, and then you would implement your campaign, whether that's informing or initiating dialogue, and evaluate it as well. The key difference, I would argue, during the pandemic is that all of this is happening continuously and rapidly. So we don't have weeks or months to sit down and come up with a very neatly thought out plan. We have to really think on our feet and be going through the process, the strategic planning process very quickly, and reviewing and revising it constantly in response to what's happening in the wider environment. When preparing for a crisis, there are some important questions to consider. The first one is making sure that you understand all the issues surrounding and existing within your organization using a situational analysis. We need to think about the sources of a crisis, what amounts to an actual crisis for your organization, because what might be a crisis for one organization might not necessarily be a crisis for another. Who decides whether careful consideration is paid to the issues that you've identified? Do you know who the key players are within your organization that you need to have on side when it comes to your communications? How respected are you as a communicator, and how much does your advice matter? Because if your advice is not being listened to, and you don't have the support of the organization, it's going to be very difficult to take the action that you feel is necessary. Is there a crisis management team in place, and is it appropriately staffed? And we're going to talk a little bit more about social media in just a second, but this can be an extremely labor-intensive activity during a crisis, and with COVID, it's likely to continue for some time. So there is perhaps an argument that more resource should be channeled into the communication side. But this is very difficult in a context where funds are extremely limited. Do you have a crisis management plan in place? I would imagine most organisations have been thinking very much about what needs to be happening operationally, but hopefully also in terms of communication as well. Have you identified and trained your key spokespeople? When we talk about training, it's really helping to ensure that they understand how the media works, how social media works, and being able to respond in an appropriately sensitive way, coming back to that point we made earlier about lives and livelihoods being very much at the forefront of what people feel matters. And who will be your subject matter experts within your organisation? Because the people who are the experts often have more credibility when it comes to presenting the key messages for the organisation. And finally, who do you call on for extra support if you need it? The next key principle is to make sure that your stakeholder map is up to date. And on this slide, we can see the textbook stakeholders that most organizations would have. But right in the middle, we have influencers. And during a crisis, it's those people that can really make a difference to your ability to communicate successfully. So it's important to ensure that all stakeholders feel they have adequate, timely information and opportunities for dialogue about how the pandemic has affected their relationship with your organization. If you can identify who the key influencers are, who have the most power and most interest in relation to your organization, and make sure that your key players are kept on side, and preferably ambassadors for your cause, then that can help you a lot with the communication effort. So amidst all of this, learn and use the power of social media. You can see on this slide that there are 5 key areas that social media can be used to support crisis communications. Firstly, through exposure and your audience being exposed to your corporate literature and messages during the crisis. Engagement, interactions that occur in response to content on your channels and how the audience engages with that content and talks to you is really important as an opportunity to help build up that positive reputation during the crisis. It's an opportunity to cause or contribute to a change in public opinion and behaviour in relation to your organisation's products or services. So the effect on the target audience of using social media effectively can include, but isn't limited to, financial impact, clients, contractors, the wider kind of impact, I guess, of being effective in your communications and that consequent effect that it has on reputation. Social media provides an opportunity for organisations to advocate for their cause and to try and encourage positive sentiments around the issues that matter and are of concern to you and your organisation during the crisis. So it can be used as a way to enlist more support behind what you're trying to do. But of course, we also still have the traditional news media, and it still matters very, very much. And the same rules that would normally apply during business as usual times still apply during a crisis. It's important to research the different media and publications, journalists, and their different agendas and audiences which are relevant to your organisation, and to build up positive relationships which will enable constructive dialogue during good times and bad times. So it's important to view the media as an ally to help you get your messages across effectively rather than an enemy. So having a positive working relationship and understanding that a one size fits all in terms of the stories that you're putting out there doesn't necessarily work. safest reactions to bad news during a crisis. Again, these are standard techniques, but still very much in play during the pandemic as well. Using statement techniques, short, clear, accurate, honest, and frequent. So if there are updates to be given, make sure that those updates happen regularly and that people are not left out of the loop. Using facts and numbers, evidence to demonstrate that what you're saying is true. A non-defensive tone can be helpful, particularly when there are many different perspectives. And in the COVID situation, of course, there are lots of different perspectives on how we should be handling things. Being able to challenge false accusations is also important, but again, doing that as far as you can in a non-defensive way. Making sure that any sources you use or have quoted are credible, and transparency and openness around what's happening too, because lack of transparency or hiding or concealing facts inevitably probably will be exposed at some point. And so it's better just to be as transparent as you can, obviously bearing in mind any legal limitations that might surround that. Fact and fiction can be very difficult to unravel sometimes, particularly in the news environment and information environment that we're living in just now. We are very much saturated by false information and ideas, and as soon as one false story is removed, another one pops up in its place very quickly. So what can we do as communicators? Well, I guess the responsibility is even greater now than ever before to ensure that the information we provide is factually correct, and trying to make that the authoritative and preferably the loudest voice in that environment when so many myths are circulating. And with all good communications, it's important to know whether what you're doing is actually having the desired impact. So we need to check that the communications have been heard and understood by all of our different target audiences and stakeholders. And then we need to review and revise anything which isn't working, and perhaps build more on the things that are working. And finally, good crisis communications involves performing the same strategic and tactical functions as business as usual communications, with similar outputs that you can see on the slide here. However, it is moving much more rapidly during the pandemic, as the external environment and restrictions are changing so frequently and unpredictably. Therefore, ensuring that your finger is on the pulse of the organisational context and stakeholder reactions has never been more important. And that's the end of my presentation. I hope you found some of those pieces of information useful, and I'm just going to open it up now to questions. Sarah.
Thank you very much, Izzy. That was a really interesting presentation, and I certainly take a lot away from it myself. And we've got quite a number of questions from the audience as well, which is great to see. But please, if you do have any other questions for Izzy, please continue to put them into the Q&A function, and we'll try and get through these. If we don't manage to answer your questions, we can do that later. And I know that Izzy's also offered that if anyone has a personal question in relation to their particular organisation, she's happy to answer any questions offline as well. So, and we can share Izzy's email address at the end. So just coming to some of the questions, Izzy, you talked a bit about some of the sort of PR disasters around the pandemic recently, and I think we've all been quite aware of them. Can you think of any organisations or governments who have handled the pandemic well, and do you have any examples of sort of good communications?
I don't, Han, to be honest. I'm more painfully aware of where it's gone. Not so well, perhaps, living in the UK. Maybe if I lived in other countries like Germany, I might have a slightly different perspective. But I think the important thing to remember is that everywhere is different. You know, so if we were to compare ourselves to other countries which appear to be more successful with their communications during the pandemic, it's important to remember that they are also operating in a very different situation as well. I guess you would look for the indicators of successful communication would be where people have understood and acted on the message in the desired way. And perhaps you could say at the point of lockdown during the first wave of the pandemic, where you could see the effect it had, you could see the reduction in cases as a result of behaviour change, would suggest that people had, to some extent, understood what the communicated messages were. I think probably it's much harder with the second wave because it is so complex and so many localized restrictions that communication has become much more difficult.
I think I agree. I think can be some of the messaging can be quite confusing. So it's maybe not necessarily bad messaging. It's just because it's so different in different areas, as you say. Really related to that, and I don't know if this is a very fair question to you, but I'll ask it to you anyway. So in question time last night, the participants were asked, who has managed messaging best, Nicola Sturgeon or Boris Johnson? Without getting into politics, what do you think?
I'm so not going to answer that one because as an academic, I'm supposed to sit on the fence a bit and not try and influence people politically. I do have views on that, but I think there are strengths and weaknesses in all sides because it is exceptionally difficult, but there are definitely lessons to be learned in some areas more than others.
Yeah, definitely. And again, there's another one that's kind of related to that, and it was one of the questions I was thinking as well, around, you know, who should be involved in your crisis communications management team. The question that's from the audience is about, given that people are so concerned about the impact on livelihoods, do you think the First Minister should bring an economic advisor as well as a health advisor to our daily briefings?
Yes, I mean, I do. I think if you're trying to represent all of your stakeholders' interests, we talk about the stakeholder map, that if you're neglecting one area, then those people are going to feel, not surprisingly, hard done by. And so it's important to ensure that you are reaching out to all of the different audiences and what they need to hear in terms of communication.
And then kind of related to that, and just what I was saying, you know, within an organisation, you talk about a crisis communications management team. Who are the key people that should be part of that team?
Yeah, that's a good question, because depending on the resources you have available, you could have one poor person who's doing all of it, or you could be in a fortunate position of having a large team who's dealing with it. One thing I think it's fair to say is at a time like this, you would be expected to need more help with the communications side of it. How you achieve that, if you're lucky enough to be in a position where you can employ an agency or employ more staff, great, but it might be that you have to train other people within your organization to help you even with some of the media management side of it. During any crisis, usually you would have a kind of reserve pool or agency that you would draw in to help you. So it's definitely worth thinking about if there's anyone else in the organization that you could enlist to help you with some aspects of the communication response. But right at the top of that management team, I would always put the leader of the organization, because if that person isn't on board with what you need to do, it's going to make it exceptionally difficult.
Definitely. And I guess, you know, you talked about the importance of, you know, keeping up to date with information, and that's particularly challenging in circumstances like this now with the pandemic, and things are changing all the time. You know, even while we've been speaking, my phone's been buzzing with new updates from, you know, from the BBC about what's happening in different parts of the country. So I guess you need a lot of people that are just keeping a track of what's going on and what that actually means for their organisation.
Yeah, definitely.
I'm just going to add, so a couple of the audience have added their points of view and where they think the communications regarding the pandemic have been handled well. So Ella Minty, who I know you mentioned at the beginning of presentation, year. And she's suggesting that New Zealand handled the pandemic communication beautifully, clear, concise, and on point. And Jacinda Ardern is a PR person by background, so that's probably quite helpful from that perspective. And Emmanuel has said another good example is Ghana.
Hi, Emmanuel.
Clear, concise, and consistent communication from the president to the nation kept the citizens well informed and ensured that there was calm. That's
Thank
great.
you
So
both
thank you
for those
yeah,
examples. Thank you
for participating. That's really helpful. Sometimes it's quite difficult when you're not doing live events and you get a bit of feedback, but we're having that with our chat, so that's great, and please keep adding to that. So another question from the audience, Izzy, is as crisis comm specialists, how do we create our own niche in the industry or market in a time like this?
I think there could never be a better time than now to create your niche as a crisis communications specialist, when there's such a huge gaping need for that kind of expertise. So yes, seize the moment. I guess it is being opportunistic, but there is very much a need. And even if you're at the beginning of establishing yourself as a crisis communications professional, even just offering to support organizations to begin with, to build up your CV so that you can then move into a position where you can be contracted to take on more work. But now more than ever is a good time to think about becoming a crisis comm specialist.
And it's the best opportunity, just as you said, to be working within a company and getting that experience that way. What about for people who are maybe not working but see this as a really interesting opportunity?
Yes, I mean, I think there's a role for everybody in any organization when it comes to a situation like this during a crisis. It's sometimes a sort of a mistaken belief that when there's a crisis, it's one or two people that are responsible for communication, because what we're talking about essentially here is reputation of the organization, the brand, its services, its products, and all employees have a responsibility for that. So, and most of us are also on social media as brand ambassadors. So there is actually a role for everybody to play here in terms of crisis communication and protecting the reputation of the organization during the crisis. But if knowing that there may well be a lack of resource or support to help with the communications, if you want to get involved, so you're speaking to whoever is in charge of communications in the organizations and offering to help, might be a good way to move more into that area.
Great. No, that's really helpful. And I guess anyone who wants more information could speak to you directly about that as well, Izzy. So that's we talked a lot about being ready and planning and getting everything set to deal with your crisis communication plan and management. What happens when things go wrong? How can a company turn if they have got an impact on their reputation? What would be your tips to help turn that around?
Okay, well, there's a lot there to unpack. Many of the things that we've already talked about in the presentation would apply in terms of recovering a damaged reputation as well. And most importantly, listening to the people who are affected, all of the people who are affected, to get the true picture and understanding of what's happened, what are people's perceptions of this crisis. You can't rely just on one party's interpretation of it. You need to speak to the different audiences that are affected to get that accurate picture. It all comes back to that research, that understanding the context fully, so that you are then in a position to communicate in the right way to the right people at the right time on the right platforms.
Thank you. Another question here. So what should you do if you're doing a recorded interview and the interviewer asks you questions that you're not prepared for and you don't feel comfortable to answer? Should you stop the interview, or might that risk future bad press, or should you just give it a go?
I would never, ever recommend stopping the interview or letting anyone else jump in and stop the interview. And don't say no comment either, because all of those things will make it far worse. It just comes over really, really bad. Honesty, if you don't know the answer to the question, just say, I'm sorry, I don't have the answer to that right now, but I will go and find out, and I will come back to you with as good an answer as I can find. If you're in a situation, as are some of our politicians, where you're having regular daily briefing sessions, you have that opportunity. You can actually say, I'll come back to you tomorrow, and we'll get, so pretending that you know the answer to something when you don't is not a good idea. Giving false information is probably going to get exposed as well. So it's being honest about what you know and what you don't know. And most people will relate to that better than acting defensively.
Yeah, no, I agree. Could you provide some details on how you would use social media during a crisis? You talked a wee bit about that in your presentation, and also what channels would you use?
Well, again, it depends on your audience. So you need to know what channels your audience are using, what kind of content that they respond to. And so it comes back to that research piece of really understanding where people are. And we saw some examples from Hootsuite from the April 2020 COVID-19, where people are, and that just gives you an indication of which ones are really people are using at the moment. So, but you do need to find out for your organization which platforms, what kind of content is going to work best. There isn't a one size fits all approach.
And I guess you
Fortunately, life would be a lot easier if there was.
No, and I guess you would use different platforms for your internal and for your external audience as well.
Yes, but remembering that your internal audience will probably also be looking at your external communications as well, because everything's very porous nowadays. What ideally you want to try and avoid is your employees hearing bad news through the media or through social media first before they hear. It's very difficult because of how porous and how fast all of these things happen, but it's ensuring that employees are top of the list of priorities in terms of communication around anything, particularly news that will affect them.
Yeah, and I think we've probably seen some examples of that as well, where in the press and things that people picked up on stuff that probably work within the organisation but are picking up external information. So I'm conscious of time, so I think we'll probably just go to the last question here. Do you think that contracting COVID-19 helped Boris Johnson support his U-turn in his narrative and strategy?
Oh my goodness. You could apply the same question to Donald Trump.
Well, yeah, I was just going to add that if you didn't mention it.
There's even a conspiracy that perhaps neither of them ever had COVID. It was all just, I mean, who knows? It's very difficult to extract fact from fiction when all of it is presented as fact. It will probably depend on your political persuasion, whether you see it as a help or a hindrance in the case of Boris Johnson or Donald Trump, how you interpret that. But that comes back to the knowing that your audience is very complex, that we don't all hold the same view. And most of us inhabit an echo chamber on social media where we only see and hear the things that we agree with, that we like, that make us feel comfortable. So we're not being exposed to those alternative viewpoints very often. So as communicators, we have to actively go out and seek them and find out what are these alternative perceptions of the crisis, so that we are not making assumptions about our communication, that we are actually developing the right kind of response for these different audiences.
Perfect. Yeah, I think it's quite interesting, because in some ways you can see that by showing that they've experienced something, you're kind of, and I think in probably in some circumstances where you can show that you've had the same experience of someone, it comes across as more genuine, your response, etc. But for something like the pandemic, it's difficult.
And I feel, I've only been able to touch on some of the things, and there's so much here which is throwing the rule book out the window, and we may not know for another few years just how much this has changed the way that we need to communicate during this type of what we describe as a mega crisis, the super volcano idea, and that we have to rethink some of the things that we do. But these are things that I think in time we'll start to discover.
Definitely. Just going to add something that that Emmanuel has added to the previous question about interviewing, and just saying that this is also where media training is very important for all spokespersons or individuals taking an interview. It's very easy for an issue to escalate into full-blown crisis just out of inexperience in communicating with the media. And they're saying I've been neck deep involved in COVID crisis response, and I can confirm from Izzy's earlier statement that it is a fast-paced, ever-changing and short time period where having experience and expertise in dealing with a crisis is very important, especially when making high-profile decisions. So that's probably quite key, again, thinking back to who should be part of your crisis communications.
Emmanuel, I would add to that and say even the most experienced communicators, like some of our political leaders, are finding this really difficult and making mistakes. You know, that's how big a test this crisis is on everybody in the communications, which I think we won't know perhaps for a couple of years what the lessons are from all of this, because so much of it is new and really testing everything we know about crisis communications.
And everyone's learning at the same time as well, which is key. Thank you so much, Izzy.
You're welcome.
Really, really interesting, and really enjoyed listening to you, and it's great to have so many questions from the audience. So thank you also to the audience, and thank you for joining us today. We do have a number of Knowledge Bites for Business coming up in the next couple of months, so make sure you check that out on our website and register to be kept informed of these. As I mentioned earlier, the recording of today's webinar will be available on the RGE Knowledge Bites for Business webpage next week. And finally, it's really important, and I say this every time, that the Knowledge Bites for Business covers topics that you're interested in as our business community. So please let us know if there's anything that you would like us to cover in the future. Thanks again to Izzy and also to all of you for joining us, and I hope you all have a great weekend.
Thanks, Sarah. Bye.
Bye.